Masquerade of Second Chances. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The invitation had arrived on a Thursday, printed on cardstock so heavy it felt like guilt in her hand. Celia Devereux had turned it over twice, her eyes tracing the embossed gold lettering without truly seeing it. The Willowmere Foundation, it read. Requesting the pleasure of your company, a masquerade gala to benefit the restoration of the historic waterfront. Celia knew what it really was. It was a trap baited with memory. For 10 years, she had built her life like a fortress, brick by meticulous brick, on the far side of the country. In Seattle, she was simply Celia, the owner of a small, beloved bookstore in a quiet neighborhood where the rain softened the world's edges. She had friends who knew her as reserved but kind, a woman with a gentle smile and a past she never discussed. They saw the calm surface and never imagined the shipwrecks lying on the ocean floor below. She set the invitation down on the polished oak counter of the gilded page, her fingers brushing against the familiar, worn spine of a first-edition Bronte. The name Willowmere was a key turning in a lock she had spent a decade trying to weld shut. Willowmere, the town, the estate, the life that was supposed to be hers, and him, Leo. She didn't let herself think his name often. It was too dangerous, a single spark in a powder keg of memory, but standing there, with the invitation glowing like a summons, the name was a hot ember in her chest. Leo Ashford, the only man she had ever loved, the man who had looked at her with such icy contempt 10 years ago, his handsome face a mask of cold certainty as he repeated the lie he had been fed. I trusted you, Celia. How could I have been so blind? The accusation had been a poison, swift and lethal. Embezzlement. They said she had stolen from the Ashford family's charitable trust, a trust her own father had helped establish before his death. They said she had exploited her connection to Leo, her access to their world, to line her own pockets. The evidence was flimsy, circumstantial, a house of cards built by someone with a motive Celia couldn't begin to guess. But it had been enough. Enough for Leo's trust to shatter. Enough for the whispers to start. Enough for her to realize that to stay and fight was to drag his name, his family's legacy, through the mud alongside her own. So she had gone. She had taken the fall in the court of public opinion, signed over everything she had to cover the supposed losses she never took, and disappeared into the anonymity of the West Coast. She had left behind her pride, her future, and her heart, which Leo Ashford had stomped into the dust without a backward glance. And now, a decade later, the Willowmere Foundation wanted her at a masquerade. A bitter laugh escaped her. A masquerade. How perfectly, exquisitely cruel. They wanted her to come home and put on a mask, just as she had done every single day for the last 10 years. But here, the mask was one of contentment, of quiet resilience. In Willowmere, the mask would have to be one of indifference. She would have to look at Leo, perhaps see him with a wife, a child, the life they had planned together, and feel nothing. Celia picked up the invitation and carried it to the small fireplace in the corner of the shop, the one that crackled merrily on damp afternoons. This was where it belonged, she thought. In the flames. Another memory to be incinerated. But she didn't drop it. She looked instead at the addendum, handwritten by her oldest and dearest friend, Margot Vance. See, you have to come. There are things you don't know, things I can't write. Please, trust me. For old time's sake, for your father's sake, come home. For your father's sake. Her father, Arthur Devereux, had been Willowmere's most beloved historian, a man whose integrity was as solid as the granite foundations of the town's oldest buildings. His reputation had been tarnished by association with her, a final, bitter injustice. Margot wouldn't invoke his memory lightly. A week later, Celia found herself on a train, watching the familiar, painful landscape of her youth roll past the window. The rolling green hills, the sudden, breathtaking glimpses of the Atlantic, the charming white steeples of villages she had once known by heart. She felt like a ghost, haunting her own history. She was staying at a small inn on the outskirts of town, unwilling to risk a chance encounter before she was ready. Margot had met her there, enfolding her in a fierce, tearful hug that smelled of expensive perfume and unconditional love. "You look wonderful," Margot declared, holding her at arm's length, thin, but wonderful. "You look the same as ever," Celia smiled, a genuine one this time. Margot, with her chic auburn bob and sharp, knowing eyes, was a lifeline to a past that hadn't all been terrible. "Now what is this all about? What couldn't you tell me?" Margot's face grew serious. She glanced around the nearly empty inn lobby before leaning in. "It's about the gala. It's not just a fundraiser, see? The foundation is announcing its new director, the permanent director." Celia's stomach clenched. "Leo." Margot nodded. "He's been the interim director for years, ever since his father's health declined. But this is the official coronation. The board is voting the night of the gala. It's supposed to be a unanimous show of confidence. Why should I care about Leo's coronation?" "Because," Margot said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I think your name is going to come up. There are people on that board, old friends of your father, who never believed that story. And there are other people, namely one Julian Croft, who have gotten very, very rich in the last 10 years. Julian Croft, Leo's cousin. The oily, ambitious man who had always hovered at the edges of their golden circle, seething with resentment at Leo's inheritance and Leo's happiness. He had been the one to discover the discrepancy in the trust's accounts. He had been the one to present the evidence to Leo, all with the theatrical reluctance of a loyal cousin forced to do a terrible duty. Celia felt the pieces click into place with a sickening thud. "You think Julian set me up?" "I know Julian is a snake," Margot said flatly. "And I know he's been lobbying hard for a seat on the foundation board for years. He's desperate for the legitimacy, the status. He wants to be a big fish in the Willowmere pond, but the old guard, your father's friends, they've always kept him at arm's length. They thought he was common. Imagine that. So you want me to come to the gala and, what, accuse him in front of everyone?" "No. I want you to come, put on a mask and watch, and be seen. Let them see Arthur Devereux's daughter, elegant and whole, and let them remember. Let Julian see you and wonder. The truth has a way of surfacing when the person it hurt most refuses to stay buried." It was madness. It was a risk. It was walking back into the lion's den, wearing a perfume of memory that might only enrage the beast. But for her father's sake, for the ghost of the girl she used to be, Celia agreed. Chapter 2. The Devil in a Domino. Chapter 2. The Devil in a Domino. The Ashford estate, Willowmere, was a sprawling Georgian manor that had watched over the town for 2 centuries. On the night of the gala, it was transformed into a scene of breathtaking fairy tale beauty. Thousands of tiny white lights were strung through the ancient oaks lining the drive, twinkling like fallen stars. The fountain in the circular courtyard had been filled with floating candles, their flames dancing in the salt-tinged breeze from the sea. Celia had Margot drop her off at the end of the long drive. She needed a moment to compose herself, to walk through the gates of her own past as a stranger. She wore a gown of deep, midnight blue velvet, the colour of a bruised sky. It was elegant, understated, and utterly unlike the bright, hopeful pastels she had worn as a girl. Her mask was a simple, elegant domino of black lace and sapphires, her grandmother's, covering only her eyes. As she walked up the drive, the sound of a string quartet drifted from the house, mingling with the murmur of 100 voices. She could see them through the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, a kaleidoscope of silks, satins and jewelled masks, a glittering society of secrets. She slipped into the ballroom unnoticed, a shadow in blue velvet. The heat and noise washed over her. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, the cold flute a grounding anchor in her gloved hand. From behind her mask, she watched the dance of power and pretense. She saw Julian Croft almost immediately. He was holding court near the fireplace, his mask a gaudy, gold-plated affair that did little to hide his vulpine features. He was speaking animatedly to a small group, his gestures broad, his laughter too loud. He looked richer, sleeker, and just as repellent as she remembered, a serpent in designer formal wear. And then, as if the temperature of the room had suddenly dropped, she felt him. Leo. He was standing across the ballroom, partially obscured by a pillar, but she would have known that line of his shoulders anywhere. The breadth of them, the way he stood with a quiet, commanding stillness that drew the eye even when he sought to avoid it. He was talking to an elderly couple, his head bent in polite attention. He wore a simple black domino, devoid of ornamentation, a stark contrast to the peacocks around him. It was as if he refused to play the game, refusing to hide behind more than the required minimum. Even masked, he was unmistakably, devastatingly himself. Her heart performed a slow, painful revolution in her chest. 10 years. 10 years of building her fortress, and one glimpse of him had brought a battering ram to the gates. She forced herself to breathe, to look away, to take a sip of her champagne. It tasted like acid. She spent the next hour circling the edges of the party, a silent observer. She heard her father's name mentioned once or twice, spoken with reverence. She heard her own name whispered once, followed by a sharp, "Shh, not here." The air was thick with unspoken history. It was near midnight when she found herself on the terrace, seeking the cool solace of the night air. The music from inside was a muted, romantic melody. She stood at the stone balustrade, looking out at the dark, restless sea, when she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel behind her. She didn't turn. She knew. "Lovely night for a masquerade," a voice said. It was a voice she had heard in her dreams for a decade, deep, warm, but now laced with a weary irony she didn't remember. "It's a shame we have to hide our faces to be ourselves." Celia turned, slowly. He was 10 feet away, his dark hair silvered by the moonlight, his mask in his hand. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. He hadn't recognized her, not yet. He saw a woman in a blue velvet gown, a woman whose posture was familiar in a way he couldn't place. "Is that what we're doing?" she asked, pitching her voice low, a little cooler than her natural tone. "Being ourselves?" He took a step closer, a slight frown on his face. "Some of us are. Others are using the masks for their intended purpose. To deceive." His gaze was fixed on her, searching. He was trying to solve a puzzle. "I apologize. I don't mean to intrude. I'm Leo Ashford. I saw you standing here alone, and I—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. He took another step, and then another, until he was close enough to touch. The moonlight fell full on her face, on the sapphires at her eyes. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and stricken. The mask in his hand fell to the flagstones with a soft clatter. "Celia," he breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a ghost he was seeing. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The music swelled from inside, a waltz. The same waltz that had played at their first dance 10 years and a lifetime ago. "Hello, Leo," she said, her voice finally her own, soft and frayed at the edges. His jaw worked, a muscle ticking violently. A maelstrom of emotions crossed his face, shock, disbelief, and a flash of the old, familiar anger that had been the last thing she ever saw in his eyes. "You're here," he said, his voice rough. "You actually came back." "The invitation was very compelling," she said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "I was told my presence was requested." "By whom? Why?" He took a step closer, and she could see the questions warring in his eyes, the old pain and the new confusion. After everything. After everything, what? She challenged him softly. After you threw me away. After you believed the worst of me without a single conversation. Yes, Leo, after all of that. The anger in his eyes flickered, dimmed by a shadow of something else. Guilt? Regret. It was there and gone in an instant. The evidence, he started, his voice faltering, was flimsy, circumstantial, and provided by your loving cousin Julian, she finished for him. But you didn't want to hear that then. You didn't want to hear anything I had to say. You just wanted me gone. The accusation hung in the air between them, a final, unbridgeable chasm. He stared at her, and she saw the boy she had loved fighting for purchase in the eyes of the man standing before her. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a sharp, jovial voice cut through the night air from the terrace doors. "Leo, there you are. The board is ready to begin the vote. We need you inside." Julian Croft stood silhouetted in the light from the ballroom, his gold mask now pushed up on his forehead. His smile was fixed, professional, until his gaze slid from Leo to the woman in blue. He went completely still. For a fraction of a second, the mask of geniality slipped from Julian's face, revealing the naked, startled fear beneath. He looked at Celia, and she saw it all, the recognition, the panic, and then the rapid, desperate reconstruction of his defences. "Well, well," Julian said, recovering with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't realise Leo had company, and such a mysterious guest." He stepped onto the terrace, his eyes never leaving Celia's. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Oh, I think we have, Julian," Celia said, her voice clear and cold as the winter sea. "But the last time we met, I wasn't wearing a mask." Chapter 3. The Unmasking. Chapter 3. The Unmasking. The ballroom fell into a hush as they re-entered. Celia walked between Leo and Julian, a triangle of tension so palpable it seemed to suck the air from the room. Margot appeared at Celia's side, her eyes wide with question. Celia gave an infinitesimal shake of her head. Not yet. The board of the Willowmere Foundation, a group of 7 elderly men and women who represented the town's old money and older values, were seated at a long table on a dais at the far end of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, whispers blooming in their wake like dark flowers. "Who is she?" "The woman in blue. Looks familiar. Can it be?" Leo stopped before the dais. He looked at Celia, a long, searching look that held a plea she couldn't quite interpret. Then he turned to the board. "I have a request," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Before the vote is taken, I ask that this assembly be permitted to hear a statement from my guest, Celia Devereux." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The name was a spark in a powder keg. Julian took a half-step forward, his face a mask of outrage. "This is outrageous. This is a private function, a matter of foundation business. I protest. Miss Devereux's presence here is an affront to this family and this town." "Your protest is noted, Julian," said a stern, silver-haired woman at the centre of the table. It was Eleanor Vance, Margot's mother, and one of her father's oldest friends. Her sharp eyes, magnified by her spectacles, fixed on Julian with open dislike before moving to Celia. "Miss Devereux, it has been a long time. Your father was a dear friend. Please, speak." Julian's face contorted. "Aunt Eleanor, I must insist." "You will be silent, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice like a whiplash. "You have had the floor for 10 years. It is time someone else spoke." Celia stepped forward. The room was utterly silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. She felt no fear, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was not here to fight. She was here to finally tell the truth. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice soft but clear. I didn't come here tonight to disrupt this event, or to make accusations. I came because I was asked to, by a friend who believed it was time the past was laid to rest. She looked at Leo. His expression was unreadable, but he was watching her with an intensity that pinned her in place. 10 years ago, I left this town under a cloud. I was accused of a terrible crime, stealing from the Ashford family trust. I was given no chance to defend myself. The man I loved believed the lie, and so I chose to leave rather than drag his name and my father's memory through a scandal. She turned her gaze to Julian, who was standing rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. I was young, and I was heartbroken, and it never occurred to me to look for a motive behind the lie. It never occurred to me that someone might have deliberately destroyed my life to get what they wanted. "This is slander," Julian burst out. "You have no proof. You left town a thief, and now you return a liar." "I left town with nothing," Celia countered, her voice gaining strength. "While you, Julian, you stayed. You took over the management of the trust's day-to-day affairs after I was gone. You invested its capital. You bought the waterfront property that the trust had been eyeing for years. You built a fortune on the foundation of my ruin." "Coincidence," Julian spat. "Business acumen." "Perhaps," Celia said. "But what isn't a coincidence is this." From a small velvet clutch at her wrist, she produced a folded piece of paper. "A letter written by you to an associate in the Cayman Islands, dated 1 week before you discovered the discrepancy in the trust's books." Julian's face went white. In her room at the inn, after Margot's revelation, Celia had done something she hadn't done in years. She had opened the small, locked box where she kept her father's letters. And she had found, tucked into the lining, a letter she had never seen before. It was addressed to her. It was from her father. In it, he had written of his concerns about Julian, his suspicions that Julian was manipulating the trust's minor accounts, skimming small amounts that would go unnoticed. He had written that he had begun to gather evidence, but he was old and tired. He had written that he feared what Julian might do if he felt cornered. He had written that if anything happened to him, she was to go to his private safe deposit box. The letter had never been sent. How Julian had gotten his hands on it, Celia could only guess. But it had led her to the safe deposit box, which her father's lawyer, bound by instructions left a decade ago, had confirmed was still waiting for her. Inside, she had found the evidence her father had gathered: bank statements, emails, and a single damning letter Julian had written, gloating about a successful transfer before the Devereux problem was dealt with. "This is a copy, of course," Celia said, holding up the paper. "The original is with my lawyer. In it, you mention the Devereux problem and your plan to remove the obstacle by creating a distraction, a scandal, an accusation." A roar of conversation erupted. Julian looked around wildly, a trapped animal. "It's a forgery. She's lying. She's a thief, and now she's a forger." "It can be authenticated," Celia said quietly, "but we both know what it will show." Leo stepped forward then, and the room fell silent again. He took the paper from Celia's hand, his fingers brushing against hers. He read it, his expression growing darker with every line. When he looked up, his eyes were not on Julian. They were on Celia, and they were filled with a horror so profound it was almost worse than the anger had been. "Julian," Leo said, his voice dangerously low, "you did this. You framed her. You used me. You used all of us." "She's a liar!" Julian shrieked, but his voice cracked, his composure shattered. Eleanor Vance stood up. "This meeting of the board is adjourned. We will reconvene after the authorities have been contacted. Julian, I suggest you stay exactly where you are." She gestured to 2 large men standing near the door. "See that Mr. Croft is comfortable until the police arrive." Julian didn't fight. He just stared at Celia, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred as he was led away through the stunned, silent crowd. Margot was at her side in an instant. Margot was at her side in an instant, gripping her hand. People were staring, whispering, some approaching with tentative smiles of apology or support. Celia saw none of it. She only saw Leo. He was standing where she had left him, the letter dangling from his fingers. He looked broken, the proud lines of his face etched with a grief that mirrored her own. He walked toward her, and the crowd parted for him as if he were walking through water. He stopped before her. "Celia," he whispered. His voice was hoarse. "I was so blind. I was so sure. He was my cousin. You were everything, and I believed him. I didn't fight for you. I didn't even listen." "You were angry," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "You felt betrayed." "I was a fool," he corrected her, his eyes blazing with self-recrimination. "I was a coward. I took the easy truth, the one that let me be angry instead of scared. I was terrified of losing you, and in trying to protect myself from that fear, I lost you anyway." He took her hand. His was shaking. "Can you ever forgive me?" She looked at him, at the man she had loved, the man who had shattered her, the man who was now standing before her, his own armor in pieces at his feet. The answer was not simple. It was a tangled knot of pain and love, of 10 years of loneliness and the ghost of a hope she had never quite been able to kill. "I don't know," she said honestly. "It's been 10 years, Leo. You can't just—" "I know," he said, cutting her off gently. "I know I can't undo it. I can't give you back the time, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. I can start by telling you the truth I should have told you a decade ago." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I love you, Celia. I never stopped. Every day for 10 years, I've woken up with the ghost of you. I've hated myself for what I did, and seeing you tonight, even before I knew it was you, something in me recognized you. Something in me knew." A tear slipped from beneath her mask, tracing a silver line down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Chapter 4. The Second Dance. Chapter 4. The Second Dance. Uncovered a decade of fraud and uncovered a decade of fraud and embezzlement, a house of cards built on the foundation of a single devastating lie. The local and national press descended, eager for a story of wealth, betrayal, and a woman's long-delayed vindication. Celia's name was cleared in the most public way possible. The headlines screamed her innocence. The Devereaux daughter, 10 years of lies unraveled. Her bookstore in Seattle was inundated with orders from people who had read her story, a small, ironic twist of fate. Celia stayed at the inn, fielding calls from lawyers and reporters, and trying to process the tectonic shift in her life's landscape. She saw Leo nearly every day. At first, their meetings were stiff, formal, filled with the debris of the past. He would come by with updates on the case, with documents for her to sign, with messages of support from the town. But gradually, the formality began to crack. One afternoon he took her to her father's grave, a spot she had been too afraid to visit. They stood in silence for a long time, the autumn wind rustling the fallen leaves. "He would be so proud of you," Leo said quietly. "He would be disappointed in you," she replied, not cruelly, but as a statement of fact. Leo nodded, accepting the blow. "I know. I'll have to live with that. Just like I'll have to live with what I did to you." She looked at him then, and for the first time, she didn't see the boy who had betrayed her. She saw a man, weathered by regret, carrying the weight of his mistakes with a new, painful humility. "Maybe that's the point," she said, "living with it, learning from it." The real healing happened in smaller moments. A walk on the frozen beach where they had once collected shells. A cup of coffee at the diner where they had shared their first milkshake. A quiet evening at Willowmere, the house finally feeling less like a mausoleum and more like a home, as Leo showed her the small garden he had planted in memory of her father's favourite roses. He didn't push. He didn't press his suit. He was simply there, a steady, remorseful, and deeply loving presence, patiently waiting for her walls to come down. And slowly, brick by brick, they did. The public vindication came at a town hall meeting called by the Foundation to issue a formal apology. The room was packed. Leo stood at the podium, his face pale but resolute. He read a statement, officially clearing Celia's name in the Foundation's records, acknowledging their catastrophic failure of judgment, and announcing the establishment of the Arthur Devereux Scholarship in her father's name, to be funded by the restitution of the funds Julian had stolen. Then he looked up from the paper, directly at Celia, who was sitting in the front row between Margot and her mother. "But that is only the official record," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The personal record is mine alone to address. 10 years ago I was given a choice, to trust the woman I loved, or to trust the lies of a jealous man. I made the wrong choice. I chose my pride over my heart, and in doing so, I broke the heart of the finest person I have ever known." A murmur went through the crowd. Celia sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "There is no apology big enough for that," Leo continued. "There is no gesture that can erase a decade of pain, but there is one thing I can do. I can stand here, in front of this town, in front of the ghosts of our past, and tell the truth." He took a deep breath. "Celia Devereux, I love you. I have always loved you. I was a fool to let you go, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life being grateful if you give me a second chance." He stepped down from the podium and walked toward her. The crowd was utterly silent, hanging on every step. He stopped in front of her and, in full view of everyone, sank to one knee. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was the ring he had given her a decade ago, the one she had left on his dresser the night she fled. He had kept it all these years. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that, but I'm asking anyway. Celia, will you marry me? Not for the sake of our past, but for the sake of our future. Will you give this fool a second chance?" The silence was deafening. Celia looked down at him, at the man who had shattered her and then spent months painstakingly piecing her back together. She saw his love, raw and unguarded, in his eyes. She saw her own reflection there, and for the first time, she didn't see the ghost of the girl who had been hurt. She saw the woman she had become, stronger, wiser, and ready to stop running. She held out her trembling left hand. "Yes," she whispered, and then, louder, with a smile that broke like dawn over the ocean, "Yes, Leo, I'll marry you." The town hall erupted. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, applauding. Margot was sobbing openly into a handkerchief. Eleanor Vance was nodding with a satisfied, regal approval. Leo slid the ring onto her finger, where it had always belonged, and stood, pulling her into his arms. He kissed her, a kiss that tasted of salt and promise, a kiss that sealed a decade of wounds and heralded a future finally, miraculously, their own. Epilogue. They were married in the garden at Willowmere 6 months later, on a day so bright and perfect, it seemed the universe was finally smiling on them. The roses her father had loved were in full fragrant bloom. The entire town turned out, a sea of happy faces. Margot was the matron of honour, beaming with pride. The ghost of Julian Croft, now residing in a state prison, was not invited. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the new Mr. and Mrs. Leo Ashford danced their first dance as husband and wife on a terrace overlooking the sea. It was the same waltz that had played at their first dance all those years ago. "Happy?" Leo murmured against her hair. Celia looked up at him, at the love shining in his eyes, a love tempered by regret and strengthened by forgiveness. She thought of the long, lonely years, the fortress she had built, the mask she had worn. She thought of the masquerade that had brought her home, the night she had stopped hiding and started living. Ecstatically, she said, and meant it with her whole, healed heart. The second chance they had been given was not a return to the past, but a new beginning, built on the solid ground of truth. And it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever imagined. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.